Yes, the way you show yourself in the books is astonishingly.
Well, it's a wonder. Of course, fiction is such a useful device, isn't it? To be able to think, and you can think things in fiction that you can't think in the ordinary essay. Not possible.
Yes.
So these novels wrote themselves, really. You know, it's like people say of fiction.
Yes, of course.
They write themselves. So.
Of course. But you have the aptitude to convey a feeling sense, because, for example, I loved your Goran Will.
Yeah.
And I loved your Selena, I don't remember her last name.
Yeah.
And I almost cried with the end of a tunnel for her.
Yeah.
Astonishingly.
Yeah. Yes.
And the metaphorical possibility of explaining the end of the tunnel as perhaps something like midlife is a very, very interesting thing too. Have you thought in that
No,
way?
I haven't thought in that way. But it's an interesting idea. Very interesting idea. Yes.
Okay.
Very interesting idea.
Well, we will, if you like, would you prefer me to ask
Sure.
a question?
Sure.
And
However you like to do it.
yes,
it's
we have
good.
done that way, and then
Nice. Yeah.
the top 10 takes us to a different place. Section 1 definition. Do you think that it exists and that it is worth speaking of something we may call midlife?
I think it's actually a complex question, and I'm going to start by saying, I'll start first from a not a psychoanalytical perspective, let's say, more of a cultural one, because it's interesting to know when midlife, as an issue, became a matter of discourse in the West.
Became
a matter of discourse.
Yes.
A matter of conversation.
Yes.
In the Western world, because it's really something that arrives in the 1960s, in the middle 1960s. We all know Elliot Jake's paper, and which occupies a lot of the literature of North America, of Europe, I assume in Latin America too. Okay. But then by the 1990s, the question of midlife is almost not being asked anymore. So we have to ask, why is something so significant for a period of time?
Yes.
Why? And also we can. I will ask you this, but we will discuss it. Why is the question returning? To me, you're asking the question now in the 21st century is interesting.
Yes.
So, if we go back to the middle 60s, of course it was just after the middle century when one can say, what is the question posed at the mid part of the 20th century? Its own middle age, so to speak. Also, I remember this very well. Now I find it somewhat embarrassing, but I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley during the free speech movement and so on. And the mantra was, don't trust anyone over 30. That was the mantra. So I think we immediately created a crisis for those who were 35 and 40 who didn't think they were irrelevant. Suddenly, my generation had rhetorically made them irrelevant. So I think they were in a crisis, in a sense, because we said you have made mistakes. Yeah, I guess I was. Shall I hold it? I can. Shall I hold it like this? No.
Yes, maybe más abajo, si no se ve la mano y listo.
Lower. Yes.
Like
right.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay. So I think it's very interesting as a cultural question that we can say is perhaps even specific to so-called Western cultures. I have not done proper reading to know if in India or if in African societies or if in China they would agree, or in Japan, that there is something called midlife. I don't know. Perhaps you know. I don't. But I think it's interesting. So if it is epiphenomenal, which we probably have to ask, is this something that has preoccupied us then it has psychoanalytical possibilities. In other words, we could say, well, has psychoanalysis nothing to say about this, or could it say something about it? So I want to begin there with just this.
Okay.
You know, Erik Erikson's work on the life cycle and other people, of course, took up the question of life in stages.
Yes.
And so we can say psychodevelopmental psychoanalysis on a Freud, Erikson, Theodore Litz, and others did indeed see life in stages.
Yes.
You know, of course, we agree that there are these stages. That's an obvious observation that one can make without being a psychoanalyst. So, and in these stages, of course, there is, at a chronologic level, a midlife.
Yes.
There is. So, but if we now move from, let's call it the obvious, to something more psychoanalytic, what would be specific about midlife from a psychoanalytical perspective? We of course return inevitably here to the question in part of narcissism, of course, because there are issues promoted by the body, ironic reversal of the adolescent
Yes,
experience,
of course.
because there the body proposes issues
Yes.
that are, let us call it, narcissistically challenging, but that by
Yes.
young adulthood we're not so unhappy with this. Because we're growing, we're
Yes.
full of this, the hubris, the pride of the adolescent, the power and the grandiosity of the adolescent.
Yes.
Middle life, of course, is a type of ironic après-coup, because the deferred affects of the adolescent arrive again at 35. But the irony here is, this is not something which we don't know how, what we will do, how can we live with these powerful changes brought about within our bodies, you know, and
Yes.
the power of the drives and so on. In midlife, one is seeing it wane.
Yes.
You see?
Yes.
So this is what I mean by an ironic
Yes.
issue. I think, of course, it is. If we go back to Freud and we say, all right, can we see the interpretation of dreams as his work at midlife? And if the interpretation of dreams is representative of Freud's interpretation of midlife after the project,
Yes.
while writing Hysteria, what do we learn from this? Well, to me, it's the best part of the book is, of course, the question that he poses: who am I? What do my dreams tell me about my unconscious? Who am I? Okay. I think this is the prevailing question of midlife. Who am I? If the question of adolescence is what am I becoming?
Yes.
Yes. If the question of young adulthood might be, let's say, the 25-year-old, 27, where do I come from? What was my family? My father, my mother? Yes.
Yes.
You know? Then I think the questions mid-30s, mid-40s is who am I? I think the question of the middle 60s is what was this about? What was life about? What was this really? It's a larger issue,
Yes.
a much larger issue.
Life in itself. as you
Life in
say.
itself, yes, life in itself. So I'm very interested, of course, in the different questions posed by the different periods in the life span.
Yes.
I think if we look at how different people manage midlife, of course, we don't exclude the body, the narcissism of the body. It is important. I think more so for the woman, and there of course are sexual differences here at midlife that are one cannot simply pass them over. They're quite serious and so on. But I think it's something to do with what the ego ideal was to begin with. What was the ideal self? And if the ideal self prior to midlife was constructed fundamentally around a grandiose body narcissism, a grandiose narcissism of one kind or another, then midlife becomes truly a crisis for this person.
Wreckage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If the individual's ideal self, which perhaps is not such a good term anymore, I mean, perhaps one could modify this concept and to adjust it to the life cycle, because we understand what we mean by the ideal self, or the ego ideal of the child, of the adolescent. We understand this. By the time I think individuals come into their 30s and 40s, they do have an ego ideal, but it's much closer, I think, to the real self.
Yes.
See?
Yes.
So it's closer. If the individual has arrived in midlife in a good enough way, to use a kind of Winnicottian
Yes.
phrase. If the individual has not, if the ego ideal or the ideal self is grandiose, etc., then of course you do have this crisis. So there's a great variation, I think, in the way people manage this. I want to go back, though, to the cultural issue.
Okay.
To a question, I'm only posing this as a question. I do not know what the answer is. Only that I think it's interesting that the great philosophical movements of Western culture, in my view, end in the 1960s. They come to a close, by which the last great philosophical movement, I think, was the existential movement, the works of Sartre, and the reinterpretations of Heidegger and so on. I think structuralism, postmodernism, and so forth are, I would say, weak philosophical movements. So at least we can say, through the work of Camus or Sartre, they raise the question of the whole of the meaning of life.
Yes.
What does it mean to be an existent?
Yes.
And before the existential movement, there were other philosophical traditions and then theological traditions that preceded them.
Yes.
Right back to the beginning of our time.
Yes.
So, if we unknowingly have lost a sense of the right to ask the meaning of life,
Yes.
and if it is being partitioned, even in psychoanalysis, through the question of childhood, the question of adolescence, the question of midlife, etc., are we unknowingly avoiding or participant in the failure to ask the questions posed by philosophy? What does it mean to be?
Yes.
You know, Heidegger's "Why is there being?" rather than nothingness.
Yes.
So I am puzzled by this. I'm interested in it.
And maybe, Christopher, that perhaps when you come to the classics, as you are telling me, that's a specific way of midlife to get a kind of symbolic immortality, going back and feeling, well, now it's my time for the classics. Because I'm sure that in the 60s you might have rejected classics, as I did in the 70s, more or less. May it be that in that way we think in a progression of generational activity.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point, because emphasis is placed in midlife on what is lost.
Yes.
Not so much on what the responsibility or the ethic is of midlife, because the individual knows that he or she is now in a generational transition,
Yes.
or is part of the parenting generation.
Yes.
The parents of the 40-year-old are now moving into elderhood, as we say now. So there is the inheritance of prior generations' contributions to one's culture. So there are these tasks of midlife. There is a responsibility. one assumes them or one does not. And your point here that, of course, this includes reception of, transmission of philosophy or theology of the past, of the many generations before, of course. I think what interests me is whether or not we would be able to agree that generations since the 1960s are reading and transmitting the history of Western culture. I have to limit myself to the West because I'm not familiar with other cultures adequately. And I'm not sure that the act of transmission has taken place, that we are actually handing on the great questions, that we're challenging ourselves to answer them, to make our own contributions. Yes. I am not sure. And so it could be that with the so-called identity politics, that also psychoanalysis by focusing on the stages is engaging in its own identity politics, the politics of the child, of the adolescent, of the midlife, of the elderly, rather than seeing this more in terms of the inheritance of all of us of the past, our interpretation of it, and our transmission of it to the younger generations.
Yes.
So it's
but you're stating a very, very important point in my view, because we can think of a generation as a whole, or we can think that there exists within each generation different sub-generations. You understand?
Yes.
So, in your way of thinking, is it possible to think of several sub-generations within the most important one? Because in that way, perhaps there exists a group of men that can transfer youth, the power of their knowledge, no?
Yes.
And the other one, they want to kill youth because they are challenging with their own assumed mortality.
Yes.
You understand?
I do, and I think actually in an essay I wrote called Generational Consciousness, I argued that really from a psychic point of view, a generation was every 10 years, not how it's customarily viewed.
Yes.
Because there are such profound differences each decade between the cultures, between
identifications.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So it's a psychical issue here. How does one group of 20-year-olds interpret their society? Then 10 years later, you get a new interpretation. 10 years after that, a new interpretation. Yeah, no, it's very, very true. I suppose I focus on the issue or the question of meaning.
Yes.
Because it's recent generations have interpreted the value of their midlife in terms of how much they have acquired, the acquisition of wealth, the acquisition of material goods and properties, and for many have actually seen the age of 35 as the time of retirement. This is when they are to retire and be wealthy. Now, of course, this is a small segment of Western society. I mean, less than 1%.
Yes.
Nonetheless, it is interesting that small percentage of people with that ambition does not, as it were, draw to it great questions of and social critique. What, as a symptom, what does this symptomatize?
Yes.
What does this mean? How is it possible that people in the financial world, etc., would collectively agree that they are seeking to retire by the age of 35? I mean, what does this mean? Well, it's rather astonishing. I see the stages of life
Yes.
as our movement in the real, in Lacan's sense, but of course in the historical sense of the concept of the real, that I think character moves in the real.
Yes.
So character and the stages of life, one's character moves through the stages. Now, how much do we know of its movement in the real? Not much. See? It's then a question of translation into the imaginary order or into the symbolic order. What do we imagine this to be?
Yes.
How do we speak about it? I think if one's character is using objects in the Winnicottian sense, and therefore fulfilling the destiny drive as I've written about, then I think midlife is a time of the bringing together, the integrating of all of the elements of character,
Yes.
and there is a sense of I would call it a type of confidence in one's movement, in one's destiny.
Yes.
If for differing reasons that is not the case, then of course you have great problems in that period of time, and we can see those who move into their 50s and beyond, into their 60s, who have made a good enough transition in midlife, and those who have not, and who are in great
life
pain.
as an object.
Yes,
Life as an object.
yes,
The using of life.
yes,
The using, destroying life. Being the owner of life
yes.
as an stage that allows us to recognize when midlife is going on successfully. You mean in that way? Can you think in that way?
Yes, I think so. It would be something that it would be felt internally. It would be a form of knowledge,
Yes.
but without the individual being able, even in a psychoanalysis, in my view,
Yes.
to articulate quite what it was that the self was doing. It would be more manifest in the real, in the sense that there would be evidence of the use of life as an object, whatever one's profession is. There would be expressed creativity. There would be obvious evolution at a creative level, no matter what the profession. And that speaks for itself. That is in the real. It's not imagined, nor can you, as it were, own it through a rhetorical action. So, and I think midlife is the period where this is visible.
Yes.
We can see
Yes.
people who are thriving, who are moving, and people who are not.
Yes. Absolutely.
So
Yes.
you see it. This, I think, is one of the interesting features of midlife.
Yes. Very well. I agree absolutely with you because you began our interview with the body.
Yeah.
No? So I think, and I am trying to let you know if I understand properly what you say. I think that, for example, your character in The Mermaids, in the chapter In the Maze,
Yes.
you pronounce In the Maze,
Maze, yes.
he's looking himself in front of the mirror, and then he goes to the maze. And I think, I always thought, and I wrote in my books, that adolescence has something resembling or in the other way around. Midlife has something that resembles adolescence because teenagers challenge in front of the mirror the exploding activity of their bodies, just like midlife individuals in front of the mirror challenge with their own imploding activity of the body. So do you think that, as you stated earlier, that is it possible to think in this way as a connectivity during the different stages of life?
Oh, I think absolutely. In fact, my son is doing his doctoral dissertation in psychology. It's at a psychoanalytical program. It's one of the few in the United States, and it's called Looking into the Mirror.
Yes.
Yeah, and he is comparing Lacan and Winnicott's mirror stages. So he's been teaching me in many ways about his work and what he's discovering. So I do think that we can look at the child that Lacan proposes at the mirror stage that is, as it were, alienated because of the difference between the image and Le Cormoiselle, the body in pieces.
Yes.
So, okay, for Lacan, this is the period of an alienation that is inevitable, that cannot be cured. Adolescence can be seen as the recurrence of this.
Yes.
The adolescent looks in the mirror, the body is exploding, and the adolescent is aware of the difference between, the image in the mirror and what's going on inside.
Yes.
And your point is that, of course, in midlife, we look in the mirror and we are aware that this image that we see, it's not how we take ourselves to be inside, or our own inner experience.
Yes.
I think this, of course, is taking place in the real. This is the biology of the self is in the real. So, the real imposes itself upon us if we like, or we can say, well, yes, but we are part of the real, so we move through it to our death, to the end.
Yes.
Okay. I think in midlife, this, as it were, rift, this discrepancy between the image, the imaginary, and the real, I think that in midlife, if all is going well enough, it's good enough, the rift between the two, between the image and the interior, is not so, I would call it narcissistically horrifying.
Yes, of course.
And of course I think also friendships become very important in midlife. The sharing of life stories together.
A friend is kind of a mirror too.
Absolutely right. Yes.
We thought we spoke about adolescence, we spoke about midlife, and you said several ideas about with your psychoanalytic thinking, but could you tell us which are Sigmund Freud's main ideas useful for our understanding of midlife? The ones you may find now at this moment, as we state in our questions, which are the main Freudian ideas you think are useful for our purpose?
Well, I actually think in many ways it's the man himself, it's the way he lived his life that comes to my mind in answer to this question. And I refer back to what we were talking about some time ago. I think that for Freud, when he turns from the project to the interpretation of dreams, when he goes from an attempt to create an exact and ironclad science of the self to a participation in the dream book through self-analysis, that he illustrates for us that if we are to grapple with the question of who we are, we have to turn to our dreams, to our dream life, to what it proposes, and to the emotional experiences provided by the act of self-analysis. So I think his way of writing in the dream book, it exemplifies this in several ways. First, he shows a remarkable responsibility in terms of his acknowledgement and use of all the writers before him who have ever written about dreams. This could be a doctoral dissertation.
Yes.
But it's really Freud showing here at midlife a respect for all the writers before him to an exhaustive extent. And then he makes the transition to his own thinking and his own dreams. It's not just step 1, 2, 3, because some of his dreams are reported early on in the book. So he's integrated it.
Yes.
He's integrating himself with it.
Yes.
So I think I would say the inevitable complexity of the dream, the fact that no dream can ever be fully interpreted,
Yes.
that every dream is a condensation, an overdetermination. This is the theory of the unconscious of Freud's, which I prefer to
Yes.
the later theory. He has several theories of the unconscious.
When I read your first novel, through the title, it remembered me the navel of dreams.
Yes.
The navel of dreams.
Yes.
That there's the deepest,
Yeah.
the utmost part of the dream that is impossible to be interpreted.
Yes. And that's a very important point, because I think if we have accomplished one of the tasks of midlife, I think it is to understand and to accept the limit of our knowledge, but also to appreciate the extraordinary complexity of human life,
Yes.
really and truly. So I think I would say, you ask, well, what of Freud's thinking, what of his theories do I think is pertinent to middle life? I would say it's more what Freud did in his midlife
Than
his theories.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
And chapter 7 of the Interpretation of Dreams,
Yes.
seems to me, is brilliant, but it slightly reverts back to the attempt to be scientific, having been remarkably open, self-revealing, passionate,
Yes, yes.
distrait.
Yes.
Then it's as if he has to say, well, now back to where
Yes.
I started, And Freud never again really captured that voice, that narrative voice that he managed to get in the Interpretation of Dreams. But it's a wonderful moment in his life, and for the rest of us, of course.
Yes.
But it, as insofar as what it exemplifies, and also because I think you can see a man grappling with dreams and creating a theory of dreams, and yet, and this is to me what's remarkable,
Yes.
each of these dreams remains as resonant and bewildering now as it did, I'm sure, for him then.
Yeah.
Even though they're not our dreams, in a way they are our dreams. We've read them enough for them to be our dreams. And so I think this is an extraordinary contribution on his part.
So you say he dared as never after he did. You say that
Yeah.
Freud dared up to chapter 7 to the known,
Yes,
and then perhaps
Yes.
he tried to settle down science.
I agree.
I have never thought that, but it's impressive.
Well, I think he was in a state of reverie.
Yes.
I think that if one thinks of the container and the contained, I think he was serving as a container for his own dream life, for his own reception of it, for his own inspiration. It was obviously he had a preconceptual understanding of this.
Yes.
Could not have started this. It was an unconscious act, the writing of this book. He realized psychoanalysis through this book. I have said before that psychoanalysis has not been adequately conceptualized in the Bionian sense. Now and then it is conceptualized. Then the conceptualization is lost.
Yes.
So it's always in a state of being realized. I think when he gets to chapter 7, he has lost the concept of psychoanalysis because it's there in the book. Then he goes and tries to. It's Freud's precocity, isn't it?
Yes.
It's his overreaching himself,
Yes,
which of
yes,
course one forgives him,
Yes,
for doing.
of course.
So
Do you know that in my way of thinking midlife, I'm trying to find the real metapsychology of midlife. So I think, starting from Freud, that there's a major paragraph in Narcissism and Introduction. The last paragraph of chapter 3, where Freud states that the most touching point of the narcissistic system is the immortality of the ego challenged by reality. No. So I highlighted that paragraph, and it reminds me that paragraph when you say the things about limits.
Yes.
The limits of what not only was one's own life, but
Yes.
the complexity of life
Yes.
and the impossibility of knowledge
Yes.
as we could have dreamt. Do you find this paragraph useful to find a way of thinking a metapsychology of midlife?
I think so. I think there are precursive moments.
Yes.
I don't recall where in one of my books. I don't know where I wrote this, but I did write one essay on the impossibility for the child to contain mental life. That the mind is too complex for a child. Therefore, children find ways to live with mental life through very close friendships, through play, and that I think that our search for friendships, vocations, but also our marriages, our friendships,
Yes.
are intrinsically regressive in a, I would say, progressive way, in that our mental life is too complicated. It's too complex. So, this I think is a discovery of each child, and they find ways to simplify themselves. So, and culture supports this simplification. So, I would say we, those of us in the differing societies, have found ways to live with a remarkable object, the human mind, which exceeds our capacity to comprehend it. So, by my midlife, I think, if there has been a successful understanding of the limit of consciousness in the comprehension of unconscious life, that we cannot understand mental life. So, when we come to the middle stage, I think by then the ambition to accomplish something remarkable at the mental level will have by then been progressively diminished. Freud, of course, the conquistador.
Yes.
Freud, the conquistador.
The conquistador.
I think, he was, of course, determined that he was going to conquer the world of
Yes.
the mind.
Symington wrote, you remember the book, yes.
So, he had this ambition, but I suppose a genius like Freud, will have this in sense of the immortality
Yes.
of the ego, and of course, in a way, he lives immortally in a way through his writings and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. It's ironic, isn't it? Because I've said, what does Freud teach one
Yes.
about midlife? But here he teaches us something else.
Yes.
That I think, we can only look at this slightly from afar because he was a genius. Geniuses are extremely rare. The rest of us, we're onlookers.
Yes.
So we see what his ambitions were, and therefore, in the essay on narcissism, why he would strike that particular point, why he would make that very particular point. Personally, I will say that when I was in my midlife, 35 to 45, and so on, I was so busy
Yes.
I was working like most psychoanalysts in Europe, 12-hour days, 5 days a week. I had a family. I was so intensely preoccupied with that the questions that we've been discussing, some of them about the meaning of life, were those that I had been working on in my 20s
Yes.
when I had time.
Yes.
So and also I think to be a psychoanalyst, it's a very different midlife, because as a psychoanalyst, one is just beginning to become a good analyst
Yes.
by one's 40s, I think.
Yes.
If you qualify, I qualified when I was 32, I think. So by my mid 40s, I was beginning to feel I'm okay at this, you know.
Yes.
And I look forward to the next years where I will be
Yes.
better.
Yes.
And really, that's what it's been. So when it could very well be that although there's this biological midlife, there are different midlives for each of us depending upon what we're doing. You know, if you play for Boca Juniors and you're 32, you're finished. It's old age.
Of course.
Yeah,
Of course.
you know, it's over with.
Yes.
So what is the midlife of Maradona? I mean, Maradona's midlife was probably when he was 22. You know?
Sure.
And then he was an old man at 28, and he was embarrassing at 30.
Yes.
You know? So it's sort of like who is it that we're
Yes.
speaking of?
Yes.
Where is their midlife? If we slightly shove aside the imperative of the chronologic,
Yes.
you know?
Yes, of course.
So, yes. D.H. Lawrence died at 40, nearly 40, and Lawrence's novels are remarkable. And if we ask, well, where was D.H. Lawrence's midlife? Where did it occur? Probably actually when he was in Australia in his late 20s, and when writing, I would say, Women in Love. You know, by the time that he wrote The Plumed Serpent in Mexico,
Yes.
it was really toward the end of his career. He didn't know he was dying. Well, he did know he was dying of tuberculosis.
And what if we think, Christopher, that midlife is not only a chronological thing,
Yeah,
but a psychological event?
indeed.
My wife and I are thinking and writing about this in founding or basing our ideas in yours. In this way, sometimes you speak of an astonishing concept that is the transformational object.
Yes.
We think that during the life cycle there exist two main and major transformational moments, which are adolescence with the exploding of the body and midlife with the imploding of the body. So we paraphrase your idea, telling that there exists a transformational moment, a very special one, that has not the prepaid part we may see in each human cycle, but it depends on complementary series, the life of each one. So it may be Maradona's midlife, might be at 20, D.H. Lawrence at 20, and yours and mine perhaps at 50, we don't know. Do you understand?
I agree with you. Yes, I agree. So the question then would be, has this person entered midlife or not?
Yes.
When is the optimal time to enter midlife? When is one inheriting one's ancestral obligations, one's generational obligations? I mean, to take a football player who makes, let's say, a lot of money and is able to look after his family of origin, because many football players come from working class families.
Yes.
They're not rich to begin with. They can come from the slums. So they then assume the responsibility of looking after their mothers, their fathers, their brothers
Yes.
and sisters, and if they can remain sane and do this, because many of them fail, because it's too early. It's a midlife in a sense that's come too soon.
Yes.
Yes.
So I think that there exists a trend, a personal trend,
Yes.
that makes us be aware of the growing old activity of our body.
Yes.
Perhaps in a soccer player, football player,
Yes.
the growing old activity begins at 25. We don't know.
Yes.
That may react our psyche in a special way. That's the way we think that happens during midlife, and that starts specifically midlife. In that part, limitations and the background of an eventual future death as
Yeah.
a threat is something that made me think of this transformational moment, but also I thought about an opportunity to transform fate into destiny. Do you think, would you agree with this?
Yes.
Because it's, how can someone transform fate into destiny without psychoanalysis?
See,
The only possibility I find is when you are shocked by an impressive unconscious movement that allows you a new opportunity to develop in the way you are teaching us.
I agree. I think that one of the remarkable features of psychoanalysis is that it can function as a transformational object for someone who has lived in a fated way. I think character disorders are fateful disorders.
Yes.
We write about character disorders. We don't write about character order.
Yes, yes.
A character as an order is more complex, of course, than character
Yes.
disorders.
Yes.
So, but that's where I think fate would be transformed by psychoanalysis. I think it's also interesting to look at certain. What comes to my mind are, let's say, conductors of symphony orchestras. Some of them are, I would say, okay. They're not brilliant. They're not great conductors. They are interesting. But then they approach the work of a particular composer, let's say Mahler, and in the course of studying Mahler's works and performing Mahler's works, something happens to them, and they change as conductors, and they become great conductors. I mean, it is interesting. So one's looking here at the transformational process here
Yes.
of the Mahler object.
Yes.
If you have to submit to the Mahler object, if you receive it into your unconscious, it's there possible for some of these conductors to be transformed by Mahler so that they then, it changes the way they conduct subsequently as musicians. So it's
Just like a psychoanalysis.
in its own way, utterly unconscious, but like a psychoanalysis, yes. I, of course, I'm very taken by Freud's definition of the unconscious in the encyclopedia articles, where he says that psychoanalysis really is an agency of change that's entirely unconscious. I mean, he places no emphasis upon consciousness at all in the 1923 essays when he's, the encyclopedia article of 1923, when he's describing the analyst's reception, evenly suspended attentiveness, where he says that the analyst catches the drift of the patient's unconscious with his own unconscious.
Yes.
This is not a theory of conscious transformation
Yes.
of the patient, but of the unconscious reception and unconscious change of patients. So even in an analysis, we would find it hard to specify. This is why I'm so distressed about this evidence-based movement in psychoanalysis.
Yes.
All this stress on evidence, the attempt to programatize it, to make it into almost a commodity. Excuse me. That actually we would find it very hard to specify what is psychically efficacious about a psychoanalysis. What were the transformative moments? It's too unconscious.
Yes. Of course. You told me earlier, trying to put an end to our interview, with I'm absolutely grateful towards you, that the acknowledgement of the limits, even as a psychoanalyst and a theoretical thinkers, acknowledging our limit is something that adds to our real knowledge. And I remember that when I wrote for the first time about our interview, you told me you would have liked to speak about wisdom, about old age.
Yes.
And I found your sayings as a kind of wisdom when you say that if we acknowledge our limits, perhaps are more human and are more prone to a real transformation, or become a transformational option for a patient, a friend, so on. Would you like to speak some words about old age?
I think it is something that we psychoanalysts and others will be writing, I think, a lot about in the years to come. There is something about being toward the end of one's life. There's something about losing friends through death, not just on occasion, but every year someone I know has died, or more than one. There's something about the genuine infirmity of the human body. You talked about the implosiveness of midlife, but in older age, there are life-threatening changes to the body. So that death is close. It's close by. And of course we always knew this. But in our attempt to, as it were, prepare ourselves, let's say, through reading, through discussion, through philosophy, I would say nothing has really prepared us for encounter with the real in this manifestation. I mean, for Lacan, the embodiment of the real is death itself. Yeah? So I think there's something, I would call it, I find myself being very fond of people of my age. I'm very happy to see people of my age, much more so than when I was in middle age. I really feel there's something heroic about the human, endurance, the human, let's call it the struggle of being a human. There is something heroic about it, and because I think that the people I admire are those who have accepted their mortality. Who I think embody it. It's in them. You can feel it, and who are not morbid about it, who are not in a manic state of denial, etc., etc. So it's very moving. There is a different temporality in old age, because up until I think one's middle 60s, more or less, we can look at the age of 30 or 35 and 40, and let's call these are the sort of charming markers of the chronology of a life.
Yes.
When we get into our 60s, I think the chronology no longer means anything.
Whoa.
I don't think so. I don't think 65 or 70 or 75 means much anymore. You know?
Yes.
Because time moving on forward now, it does not have the same celebratory meaning.
Yes.
So there's a timelessness, an atemporality that I think
Yes.
we arrive at in old age, that I believe has intriguing dimensions in common with unconscious life itself. I think we come closer to dream life
Yes.
in old age than ever before. And I think our dreams have a much greater resonance to them, and a wisdom to them, and we listen to them more. We pay more attention to them.
Yes.
And so it's interesting. It's a remarkable period to be alive still.
Yes. Well, I thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yes.
Cheers.
Our pleasure was. That's my wife, Alicia.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Nice. You've all done very well.
Really, right.
Have a good Congress. Thank you.